I was a sophomore at Kansas State University. I had just started dating a newly graduated football player from Kansas State. Christmas, he asked me to come back to school early. So I came back to school early, and he had a special date arranged, and that was taking me out to a farmhouse, fireplace and everything lit, but he was 6'5" and wanted one thing that night. And I just could not get away. So that night, I lost a precious gift. I lost my virginity in a horrible situation, and if I'd called the police, they would have just patted him on the back, because this is the early 70s, they would have just patted him on the back and called him the good old boy, and that I'd put myself in a bad situation. 2 months later, I'm pregnant. And we didn't talk about pregnancies back then, so I had no idea what to do. So my only choice was I had to go home and tell my parents. My dad was a deacon in the Baptist church. My mother was at the door every time that church opened. And I really didn't know what to expect when I went home. So I go in the door, and after I explained what happened and the initial shock, it was like they just went into action. My dad called our family physician. This was a Sunday. He called our family physician, who was a personal friend. Immediately, they arranged for me to go to a town 50 miles from Topeka to have a D&C, because this is before Roe versus Wade. Abortion was not legal. I was in a hospital room in the maternity ward. They kept me overnight, and I was sitting there by myself. And when I woke up, I came to, and the other family in the room had other children and just were celebrating their new baby. And I sat there alone and realized I had made the biggest mistake of my life, but I just didn't realize how big a mistake it was. About 3 days later, I was back at K-State, but by this time, I had no interest in going to classes. All I had interest in was partying and drinking to drown what I'd done. So needless to say, at the end of the semester, I went back to Topeka and continued the same destructive path, the partying, got a job at the TV station, and then started dating the weatherman there, and eventually we got married, and a couple of years after that, we had my son Shay. I always thought that God, because God was in my life only superficially, and I always thought he was going to punish me by taking my son away. So I lived with that dread, and when he was born, I was overprotective. I was always afraid God was going to take him away. Never tried going to church again, because I knew they were all good people sitting in church, and I was not a good person. No good person kills their baby. So 6.5 years later, that's all the marriage lasts. 6.5 years later, I get divorced. Within a year and a half, I'm engaged again. But 2 weeks before that wedding, I called it off. So I came back to Amarillo. The first day that I moved here, I met what was going to be husband number 2. Never dated anybody else, but husband number 2. And we did go to church, but it was in a Sunday school that actually everybody was there to party. So we found the perfect Sunday school, and nobody stopped us. No one said that that was wrong. So that marriage ended in 6.5 years. And then I immediately met my third husband, Patrick. And still we continued the partying path, the drinking, heavy drinking, and not leading. We were going to church, but we were not there to better ourselves through Christ. But eventually I got bored and decided I needed to do something to be worthy. So I found CareNet through a friend and went to the banquet, thought, I think I could do this. I think this place probably could use me. So you had to take the volunteer training, took the volunteer training, and then The catch-22, which I didn't know about, was if you'd had an abortion, you had to take their post-abortion forgiveness class. So I didn't think I needed it. I didn't feel like it was necessary in my life, but I went. And I sat there and I did the homework. It's a 13-week course. I did the homework, and at the toward the end, or the middle, I'm sorry, of the study, it came naming your baby. Again, I thought that was ridiculous. So the night before, I was doing my homework and I couldn't think of a name. So I thought, well, I'll just put down the name that I was going to name Shay, but my husband then didn't like the name. So I'll just put that down. So I put the name Aaron down. The first thing they did was hand out a worksheet, and with the name at the top, this big, was the name Aaron. I thought I was going to pass out. I put my book over to one of our leaders and I said, that's the name I was going to name my son, Shay. And she said, you couldn't name him Aaron because you already have a child in heaven by that name. At that point, it was a gradual, but I knew I was forgiven. I knew I was worthy. I knew God had gotten me to the one place that could help me understand God's forgiveness and to forgive myself. So after taking that and starting to volunteer, immediately God opened the door to sonogram coordinator. And so I got to share my testimony with each and every one of these and tell them not only to try to save that precious baby, but also to try to help save her life, because she would go down the same road of destruction that I'd been down. And again, by the grace of God and a great team at CareNet working together, we saved most of those babies. I have been married to my husband, Pat, for 27 years now, a little over that. And so I know now that I am worthy. I know He opened up all these doors, but He did not open those doors until I accepted His forgiveness. If you've had an abortion and you are on that destructive path that I was on, and you don't believe you can be forgiven, you have to know from my testimony that if I can be forgiven, you can be forgiven, and that God loves you and wants you to accept that forgiveness.